In my first lecture, I considered some of the ways in which ethical issues are framed in the biblical text and how that framing may compare or contrast with modern discussions of human rights. There are, in fact, two significantly different ways in which human rights are framed. One way, enshrined in the American Declaration of Independence, sees rights as endowed and guaranteed by the Creator. The other, exemplified by the French Declaration and the United Nations Declaration, makes no reference to a creation or a higher power and sees rights as a matter of negotiation between human beings. While the Bible does not have a discourse of rights, one may reasonably argue that certain rights are implicit in biblical laws. For example, a right to own property, however understood, is implied in the prohibition of stealing. These rights are understood as part of a divinely imposed order. But are these rights commensurate with human rights as understood in a modern context, or as articulated in the great declarations of human rights, even when they ascribe rights to a creator? In this lecture, I will consider some of the basic rights that are fundamental to modern conceptions of human rights and consider how they are viewed in the Bible. The most fundamental human right in all declarations on the subject is the right to life. What does the Bible have to say on this subject? We've already noted the words of God to Noah in Genesis 9, forbidding the shedding of human blood because humankind is made in the image of God. But we have also noted the penalty. By a human, that person's blood should be shed. The prohibition of murder does not entail a right to life, or at least that right can be forfeited. In fact, the Hebrew Bible describes the death penalty for a bewildering array of offenses, from disobedience to one's parents, not sure at what age that kicked in, to adultery, to gathering firewood on the Sabbath. But interestingly enough, not for property crimes, which is interesting. This severity was even a matter of pride for Jewish apologists in antiquity. The philosopher Philo, who lived in Alexandria at the time of Christ, boasted of the superiority of Jewish law because of the policy of zero tolerance. We should not assume, of course, that the death penalty was carried out in all cases where it was prescribed. In fact, we know that it was not. But as a matter of principle, it undermines the idea of a right to life. It is not only a matter of a right being forfeited in some circumstances. On the contrary, the book of the covenant, supposedly given to Moses on Mount Sinai, contains a shocking commandment. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and your sheep. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. That's Exodus 22, verses 29 and 30. To be sure, this commandment is amended in Exodus 34 to allow for the redemption of sons, while clarifying how something was given to God. The firstborn of a donkey could also be redeemed, but if it was not redeemed, its neck must be broken, which makes clear that the way you give something to God is you kill it. That's how you make it pass over into the spirit world. The original commandment was kept on the books, so to speak, to make the point, all that first opens the womb is mine. Whether child sacrifice was ever practiced in Israel or to what degree remains controversial. But the idea was certainly entertained. The most famous case involving child sacrifice is in Genesis 22, where Abraham is told to sacrifice his son Isaac. When God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, there is no objection that Isaac has a right to life. And Abraham doesn't hesitate. In the end, Abraham doesn't have to go through with it. God provides a ram in the bushes, which can be substituted. But Abraham is praised for his willingness to execute the demand. Some people argue that the reprieve shows that God doesn't want child sacrifice, but it is strange to praise someone for being willing to do something one doesn't want. The prophet Jeremiah insisted that the idea of human sacrifice never entered God's mind. But his contemporary Ezekiel says that God gave Israel statutes that were not good and ordinances that they could not live by, and defiled them by their very gifts of offering their firstborn, so that I might horrify them. That's Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 and 26. In fact, life is given and taken away at the Lord's discretion. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. In recent years, the putative right to life has been associated especially with the question of abortion. Here again we encounter an enigma. Abortion is never discussed in the Bible. The text that served as the basis for later discussion in Exodus chapter 21 considers the case of injury to a pregnant woman. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. I think that's an obvious case of redaction of a biblical text, that originally it said, whatever the husband demands, and then somebody added, well, as much as the judges determine. But this is an accidental miscarriage and not the same thing as intentional abortion initiated by parents. The relevance of this text to the discussion of abortion was greatly heightened by the Greek translation, the Septuagint, made in the 3rd century BCE. In the Hebrew of Exodus 21, a rare word, ason, is used for harm. The Greek translation, I think the Greek translators didn't understand the word, and they departed rather radically from the Hebrew. If two men fight and strike a pregnant woman, and her child comes out not fully formed, he, the striker, shall be forced to pay a penalty. But if it is fully formed, he shall give life for life. A fully formed fetus is reckoned a life, whereas one that is not fully formed is not. This view remained influential in Jewish tradition. In the Mishnah, compiled in the late 2nd century, the fetus was only regarded as a person after birth, or at least after the crown of the head appeared. Mishnah Nida declares that a person is born when the greater part of its head has come forth, or in the case of a breech birth, the greater part of its body. Before that, abortion was permitted, at least in some cases. If a woman is suffering a hard labor, the child must be cut up while in her womb and brought out member by member, since the life of the mother takes precedence over that of the child. That's the Mishnah. But if the greater part of the head has emerged, then one cannot give precedence to one over the other. A person who kills a one-day-old baby is criminally liable and subject to the death penalty, but there is no such sanction for killing a fetus. The medieval exegete Rashi understood the Mishnah to permit abortion because the fetus was not yet a nephesh, or a person. We do not, however, find this kind of discussion about the beginning of human life or personhood in any biblical source. The closest approximation is in Jeremiah chapter 1. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. Or Psalm 139, it was you who formed my inward parts, who knit me together in my mother's womb. In the New Testament, Elizabeth tells Mary that the child in my womb leaped for joy. And Paul says that God set him apart from my mother's womb. None of these passages, however, amounts to a discussion of the beginning of life or personhood. The fetus is formed in the womb whether it is already a person or not. And everyone knows that babies move in the womb. Abortion is condemned in Christian tradition, beginning in the early 2nd century, and occasionally condemned in Jewish sources, such as the historian Josephus, who wrote in Greek at the end of the 1st century. And typically, Josephus claims that the Bible, the Torah, forbids abortion, although it doesn't. But the subject is not explicitly addressed in either Old or New Testament. I'm not suggesting that abortion was condoned because it is not condemned. It is simply a subject on which the Bible provides no guidance. It is not at all clear why this was so. We have a recipe for a concoction that would cause an abortion from ancient Egypt in the 2nd millennium. That recipe might have been enough to deter people from having an abortion. The only people in the ancient world who explicitly forbade abortion were the Assyrians, who are notorious in the Bible for ripping open pregnant women. But they, in fact, had a law forbidding abortion. So the practice was known. Job at one point wishes he had been aborted. The practice was dangerous, and in general, children were considered a blessing in the ancient world, including Israel. There was a high infant mortality rate, but there must surely have been cases of unwanted pregnancy. The most important consideration may have been on clarity as to when human life begins. In the Greco-Roman world, unwanted babies were often exposed, and this practice them from the Egyptians to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey. Nonetheless, after the revelation at Mount Sinai, the first of the case laws begins. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go free. The thrust of the law is to modify the treatment of slaves by imposing a limit, at least in the case of male Hebrew slaves. The limits apply unevenly to men and women. If a male slave comes in married, his wife can leave with him. But if his master gives him a wife, she remains the master's property, as do her children. An attempt is made to address this imbalance in Deuteronomy 16. And I would note here in passing, biblical laws are revised. They are changed within the Bible itself. Deuteronomy 16 limits the servitude of both men and women. In Leviticus, those who sell themselves into slavery are to be treated like hired servants, but they are bound until the year of the Jubilee, so they could be in for a much longer time. Also, a slave's children should be released with him, which was not the case in Exodus. But there are no restrictions on slaves who are not Israelites. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. At no point do these laws question the institution of slavery or suggest that all human beings have an inalienable right to freedom. The Exodus was apparently a special case, and even those who escaped from slavery in Egypt are given no guarantee of exemption from future slavery. Even in the New Testament, the institution of slavery is never questioned. Jesus often refers to slaves in his parables, which we usually deal with by translating servants, but it's the same word in Greek, and accepts slavery as a fact of life. No master invites a slave who has been laboring all day to eat before he himself eats. Rather, he expects the slave to serve him at table. Even those who do what they ought to do are still unprofitable and deserve no special commendation. The status of slaves is discussed more explicitly in the Pauline epistles. For Paul, slavery is not important. Followers of Christ should not expend any energy in trying to escape it. Were you a slave when called, do not be concerned about it. For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a freed person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever was free when called is a slave to Christ. In whatever condition you were called, there remain with God. The ringing proclamation in Galatians 3, in Christ there is no longer slave or free, no longer Jew or Greek, no longer male or female, for all are one in Christ Jesus, evidently did not mean that slaves were free to rebel against their masters. Paul was evidently affirming freedom on a spiritual level. It was, of course, hugely significant that slaves were welcome in the Christian community, but the passage does not challenge the institution of slavery itself. Paul's view of slavery is very much at issue in the epistle to Philemon, where Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon. The traditional interpretation is that Onesimus was a runaway slave. In recent years, opinion has shifted in favor of the view that he was not a fugitive, but was at odds with his master, so that Paul had to intercede for him. It seems clear that Onesimus was a slave and that Paul recognized Philemon's rights over him. It is less clear what Paul wanted Philemon to do. He says that Philemon can have Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother. Is this a subtle way of asking Philemon to set him free? Perhaps, but not necessarily. It may mean that Philemon should love him as a fellow Christian, but keep him as a slave. Paul notes that he had wanted to keep Onesimus with him to assist him. Is this a subtle way of asking Philemon to let him stay with Paul? Paul stops short of making explicit requests, and the implication is that Philemon is not under any obligation to free Onesimus or to assign him to Paul. Martin Luther commented that this letter gives us a masterful and tender example of Christian love. For we see here how St. Paul takes the part of poor Onesimus and as best he can pleads his case with his master. Modern readers are more likely to see Paul as excessively deferential to a slave owner. At no point does he suggest that Onesimus was endowed by his Creator with an inalienable right to liberty. We miss the passionate denunciation of evil characteristic of the Hebrew prophets. Paul's strategy may have been effective in ensuring that Onesimus was treated humanely, but it lends no support to the claim that people are endowed with a right to liberty. The later Deutero-Pauline epistles are even more problematic. In Colossians chapter 3, we read, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but wholeheartedly fearing the Lord." Similarly, Ephesians 6 calls on slaves to obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling in singleness of heart as you obey Christ. 1 Timothy explains the rationale. Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be blasphemed. By the time of the pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus were written, probably in the 2nd century. The Christian churches were greatly concerned to avoid any suggestion that they wished to overthrow the prevailing order. Human rights did not factor into the situation. Is there a right to private property in the Bible? The rights affirmed by the French Declaration included the right to own property. This was one of the cases where René Cassin claimed a biblical origin in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal is the right to own property. In fact, some right of ownership is presupposed in the Bible, as it is in most, if not all, societies. Of all the rights claimed since the Enlightenment, this is probably the one that has the strongest biblical basis. it is not necessarily an unlimited right. In some passages, the ideal seems to be a state of sufficiency for everyone to have his own vine and his own fig tree. But the right is not at all defined. It is surely not unlimited. Isaiah proclaimed woe on those who joined house to house and field to field until they dwelt alone in the midst of the land. If there is a right to private property, it is surely a right to have enough to live on, not a license for unlimited acquisition. It is not at all clear whether any right of ownership was enjoyed by everyone. Slaves and even women did not have the same rights as Israelite males in this regard, so the right of property doesn't qualify as a human right. Perhaps the most egregious example of disregard for human rights concerns ownership of the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. Still very much at issue. According to the Hebrew Bible, this land was given to Israel after the Exodus and its occupants designated for slaughter. The conquest of Canaan does not seem to be historical fact. It was a fiction promulgated at a much later time, but this does not relieve the moral problem, as it proposed a paradigm for the displacement of indigenous peoples that continues to have effects down to the present day. It is sometimes suggested that the occupation of Canaan was justified by the wickedness of the Canaanites, but there is no evidence that the Canaanites were any more wicked than anybody else. But neither is Israel given an inalienable right to the land, and its population too would suffer a series of displacements. The prophet suggested that this was punishment for failure to keep the law, but again, this is not very persuasive. Success and failure in history is seldom determined by virtue or wickedness. What are the rights of women in the biblical tradition? In 2012, Christopher Rolston, a respected biblical scholar then teaching at Emmanuel Christian Seminary in Tennessee, published a piece in the Huffington Post entitled "The Marginalization of Women, a Biblical Value We Don't Like to Talk About." Many scholars would say that Rolston was belaboring the obvious. Nonetheless, he was told to seek employment elsewhere, which happily he did. Laws relating to women in the Hebrew Bible are often problematic from a modern point of view. Women could not inherit unless there were no sons. A woman's vows could not be nullified by her father or her husband. Adultery was understood as having relations with the wife of another man. According to Deuteronomy, if a woman was found not to be a virgin when she married, she was to be stoned. A man who falsely accused his bride was to be fined 100 shekels, which went to the girl's father, but she would remain his wife and he could not divorce her. If a man had relations with a woman who was engaged to be married to another man, both were subject to the death penalty. But if it happened in the country where the woman could not cry for help, she was excused. If a man raped a virgin who was not engaged, he was to pay 50 shekels to the young woman's father and marry her. He could not then divorce her. In normal circumstances, it was assumed that a man could divorce his wife, but women could not initiate divorce. Many of these laws had an economic aspect. The groom had to pay a sum of money called the mohar, or bride price, to the bride's family. This is only mentioned in cases of rape or seduction, but it is thought to have been customary. While it may give the impression that marriage was a purchase, the reality was more complex. Such payments are known in many traditional societies. In the later biblical period, the bride price was paid by a promissory note, payable only in the event of divorce. The dowry which a woman brought with her into the marriage remained her property. Both bride price and dowry provided security for the wife in the event of divorce. Even the law that required a rapist to marry his victim was meant to protect the woman, since she would have difficulty finding another husband. Some allowance must be made for the customs of traditional societies, but it is clear nonetheless that women were subordinated to their male relatives in many respects. This doesn't mean that they were oppressed or that they were unhappy in their roles, but they did not enjoy rights equal to those of men, as modern human rights advocates demand. One of the oldest arguments for the subordination of women in Christian tradition is based on the story of Adam and Eve. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 notoriously tells women to be silent and submissive. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. That passage is probably not by Paul, but the apostle too had argued that man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. That's 1 Corinthians 11. Paul himself seems to have recognized that this exegesis of Genesis was not very convincing. For he went on, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. In Genesis, creation was that woman was created as a helpmate for man, but that doesn't necessarily imply subordination. Paul ends that passage by saying, in any case, we have no other custom. In effect saying, this is the way we do it. But I think it is the case where somebody, a quite distinguished professor no longer with us, once argued that we should model our exegesis on the exegesis of Paul. I would hope not, frankly. As exegesis of Genesis, that's terrible. In Genesis, the only passage in Genesis 2 to 3 that clearly casts the woman in a subordinate role is in Genesis 3:16, when God discovers that Adam and Eve have eaten the forbidden fruit. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. In Genesis, this pronouncement is a punishment. It is not the original plan of creation. The man must eat his bread by the sweat of his brow. It is apparent that this is what the author of the Genesis passage thought was the normal condition of men and women. In other words, it is an etiology. It's a story told to explain why is life so hard. It was not meant to be prescriptive. No one in the modern world would conclude that men should not find alternatives to physical labor, nor indeed that women shouldn't try to mitigate the pain of childbirth. And so to take that passage as prescriptive, again, would be very bad exegesis. In Genesis, both Adam and Eve are guilty of disobedience. If either one bears greater responsibility, it is Adam, because he seems to hold the primacy. And in fact, the act of disobedience became known as the sin of Adam. See, in the end, people do always blame the man. Adam was deceived and became a transgressor just as much as Eve did. The attempt in 1 Timothy to put the blame on Eve seems to be due simply to cultural prejudice rather than to exegesis. On the positive side, in Genesis 1, when God creates human beings in his image, he created them male and female. Women as well as men are made in the image of God. This does not mean that the biblical writers, or more specifically the priestly writer responsible for Genesis 1, had a gender-free view of humanity, as has been claimed by a person who was once my colleague at the University of Chicago, but not quite, I'm afraid. On the contrary, the social roles of women and men are consistently distinguished in biblical law. Insofar as one can argue that the image of God indicates intrinsic worth and may therefore be thought to entail certain rights, this applies equally to men and women. That position was distinctive in the ancient world and was remarkably progressive, even if they don't seem to have followed through on it. Equally, at the other end of the biblical canon, we find the statement in the Epistle to the Galatians that Christ is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. And again, this does not mean that social distinctions are abolished. Slaves must still obey their masters, and women must obey their husbands. Notably, the statement that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek is paralleled in 3 other passages in the Pauline epistles. And the statement about slave and free is paralleled in 2 of those. The statement about male and female is found only here. Nobody wanted to repeat that one. Nonetheless, it affirms in principle the equal status of male and female. In the case of Galatians, the abolition of distinctions is a utopian ideal. It is anticipated in the church to some degree, insofar as Greek slaves and women were welcome in the Christian assembly, but it awaited its public fulfillment in the future. Within the biblical corpus, this did not lead to an affirmation of women's rights, nor indeed did it do so when Christians came to control the laws of society. Nonetheless, it is an important instance of a biblical text that can be said to be pregnant with meaning that would only be recognized in later times. And here again, I think you can see where I'm going with this. You cannot take the pronouncements of the Bible as the last word. You've got to locate the Bible really in an ongoing tradition, which is a living tradition, but I'll talk more about that this afternoon. Contemporary rights theorists update Galatians 3:28 with 3 other binaries that should be abolished: gay and straight, black and white, and healthy and disabled. St. Paul surely had not dreamed of such extensions of the formula. But then Thomas Jefferson never dreamed of some of the rights that have been claimed on the basis of the American Declaration of Independence. Only one of these binaries, gay or straight, is at all discussed in the Bible, and only in a few verses. But it illustrates a fundamental contradiction between biblical assumptions on the one hand and modern ideas of human rights on the other. Leviticus 18:22 tells the presumably male reader, "You shall not lie with a male the lyings of a woman. It is an abomination." And Leviticus 20:13 specifies that both parties should be put to death. There is some debate as to what exactly is meant by the lyings of a woman. But the simplest explanation is, I think, that any kind of sexual intercourse between males is forbidden. The Hebrew Bible has nothing whatever to say about relations between women. As I mentioned at the start of my first lecture, the first time I taught the introduction to the Old Testament at Yale, I was teaching it in the chapel because there was construction going on outside. And when we got to this verse, I threw out the questions, what does this forbid? And no answer, of course. And so after a minute or two, I said, sexual relations between men. And a woman at the back of the class went, phew. But it was only a limited reprieve, because when she got to New Testament, she found that Paul caught that one. It was considered, in ancient Greece, it was considered shameful for a man to be penetrated, but not the penetrator. But in Leviticus, both parties are condemned. There are a few other passages in the Hebrew Bible of possible relevance to homosexual relations, notably the story of Sodom in Genesis 19 and the story of David and Jonathan in the books of Samuel. The Genesis story is complicated by issues of hospitality, but in any case, the relations envisioned are not consensual. The men of Sodom want to rape Lot's guests. So that, I think, isn't a fair case, in a way. This is also true of the story of the Levite in Judges 19. But according to 1 Samuel, Jonathan loved David as he loved his own life. And after Jonathan's death, David declares that his love was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. We are never told just how this love was expressed. And so, in the words of Martin Nissinen, a Finnish scholar, the text thus leaves the possible homoerotic associations to the reader's imagination. There is no hint of condemnation in this case. I must say, when I taught this in my Biblical Values course at Yale, a number of people were always disappointed that I didn't say that this shows approval of homosexual relations. But, it's way too discreet for that. It's not excluded. I mean, you're just not told how David loved Jonathan, but it doesn't at the same time say anything that is explicitly sexual. The clear biblical condemnation of sexual relations between men then rests on 2 verses in the Holiness Code in Leviticus, and the subject isn't mentioned at all in the prophets or wisdom literature. And this is one of the things you notice going through biblical values, is that the things that are emphasized in the current culture wars aren't always the things that were emphasized back in the Bible. And some of them just weren't really issues of great concern, apparently, at all. Similarly, in the New Testament, same-sex relations are only discussed in a few verses, a few passages in the epistles. The most notable passage is in Romans 1, where Paul declares that God punished idolaters by giving them up to degrading passions. The women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. While there's some dispute as to what is meant by natural, it seems clear enough that the objection is to same-sex relations. There have been some attempts to argue that Paul was only objecting to abusive relations, such as pederasty, or to heterosexuals performing homosexual acts, but those attempts are not at all persuasive. In the ancient world, they didn't recognize some people as homosexual by disposition. They only thought in terms of acts, of actions. Like Leviticus, Paul holds both active and passive parties guilty and does not recognize sexual orientation as a factor at all. Unlike Leviticus, Paul objects to same-sex relations between women as well as men. It's an interesting question why the Hebrew Bible doesn't condemn sexual relations between women. Again, you would figure, human nature being what it is, it cannot have been completely unknown. But they don't seem to have thought it was important. And I think part of it was that there was no waste of seed involved. It wasn't wasted procreation. But they don't actually say. While the negative judgment on same-sex relations is marginal in both testaments, it is clear and very much at odds with modern views of human rights, at least I think as envisioned by the United Nations and in the French Declaration. If human rights are conceived as granted by the Creator, then Paul's condemnation of same-sex relations is not necessarily in violation of human rights. Human rights are limited by what is right according to God's law or natural law. On that understanding, those who engage in same-sex relations may still have rights, such as freedom from discrimination or from violent abuse, but not a right to violate what is understood to be God's law. Those who argue for gay rights in the modern world proceed on different assumptions. As in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, rights arise from human needs and desires and are limited only if they infringe on the rights of others. In this case, Paul's prohibition would only be justified if the conduct in question were shown to harm other people. In this case, at least, I think it makes a fundamental difference whether one's starting point is theocentric or anthropocentric. In all of this, I have emphasized the gulf that separates modern human rights thinking from the biblical view of the world. The point is not that creatures do not have any rights in the Bible. Some rights may be inferred from laws. As we've seen, there's some right to private property, but is that a human right in the sense defined by the United Nations? It is not a right that everyone has in virtue of being human. Rather, it is defined by the laws of a specific society. Nonetheless, several key ideas in the Bible are pregnant with potential for thinking about human rights. These include the biblical idea of justice, which is arguably the most important contribution of the Hebrew Bible to the development of humanity, the notion of humanity as the image of God, the command to love one's neighbor, which is something I will talk about this afternoon, and the eschatological vision of a world where polarities of race and gender will no longer be divisive and where the wolf will lie down with the lamb. Most fundamental of all, I would argue, is the idea that all human beings are creatures of the same God. And this is, the double edge of the idea of creaturehood. That on the one hand, creatures don't have rights. We should be glad that we're here at all. Life is a gift. But on the other hand, if we're all creatures, that puts us all on an equal footing. And so I think common creaturehood is a very important idea. So I think is the idea of empathy, which one prominent figure declared to be the problem with modern society. But I would grant his perceptiveness. Empathy is really, I think, one of the fundamental bases for human rights. So there is such a thing, I would argue and will argue this afternoon, as common humanity, even though that is often disputed nowadays. And indeed, in some cases, there are problems with it. Cultural diversity presents certain problems to the issue of common humanity. But I think there is such a thing, and the idea of creaturehood, which undercuts our claims of rights in one sense, it creates the basis for thinking about common humanity, which is the prerequisite of any discussion of human rights. So I will talk a bit more about those things this afternoon. I will spend some time considering some of the modern objections to the whole idea of universal human rights, but also dwell a bit more on the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself and what that might mean and entail.